I'm here to talk about the violence in video games. This is a very controversial issue, as some believe that violence in video games can cause to violence and aggression in real life, and some disagree. Violent video games should be considered dangerous because 1, they can have negative behavioral effects, 2, because of the vulnerability of their targeted audience, which is kids and adolescents, and 3, because of the lack of sufficient regulation on the content of the games and the sale of the games. Negative effects include poor social skills, lower grades in school, weight gain, and aggression. Brad Bushman, who's a social psychologist who works at the Ohio State University, did an experiment where he took 2 groups. He had one group play violent video games and another group play video games without any violence. And after he had them play them for however long, he took the 2 groups and he showed them both violent, gory images. And the group that was exposed to the violent video games were kind of unfazed when they saw the photos. They didn't respond emotionally, and they didn't seem like they had a problem or any sort of response to the scary images, while the group that did not play violent video games reacted like you would expect someone to react, and they showed emotion, and they were upset by the photos. And this is an example of how the violence in video games can cause people to become desensitized. Bushman also had the students do a noise blast test, and they were set up with an opponent, and they had the option to either blast their opponent with a really loud noise like a siren, or just send them like a sort of loud noise. And those who were exposed to the violent video games and had spent time playing them were more prone to be aggressive and choose the loudest noise for their partner to hear, which could potentially harm their hearing. So Bushman concluded that the exposure to violent video games can lead to people having more aggressive behaviors. Other than aggression, another negative effect would be addiction, and everyone knows that no matter what type of addiction it is, addictions can be very challenging to overcome, and they can cause a lot of problems and a lot of hurt. If you were to be addicted to video games, again, you would have poor social skills, you could become overweight, and you would have a lot of time spent away from your schoolwork and away from your family. I interviewed Dr. Drew Edwards, a healthcare researcher, an author, and a clinician, and he explains that teenage boys are particularly vulnerable to becoming addicted to violent video games and video games with sexual content. Other than aggression and addiction, another negative effect would be violence. And my first example is of Devin Moore, who is an 18-year-old who played Grand Theft Auto day and night for several months, and he shot and killed 3 men, 2 of them being police officers. What happened was he was accused of stealing a car, and so he was taken to the police station, and he took the first opportunity that he had to take a gun to kill the 3 people that were in his way of escape. He took car keys, he stole a police car and tried to escape, and his actions, his escape, is just like how you would escape and act while playing in the video game if you were a character in Grand Theft Auto. He was even quoted saying, "Life is like a video game, everybody's got to die sometime." The second example of violence in video games leading to violence in the real world was the shooting at Columbine High School. 2 teenagers, Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, decided to gun down a school, and they ended up killing 13 innocent people and then taking their own lives. They were known to play the violent video game Doom. Parents of the victims of the Columbine shooting sued id Software, which is the company that made Doom and several other violent video games. They basically blamed that company for teaching these 2 teens how to kill. If you want to take a look at this picture, this is a picture of the shooting at Columbine. These are the 2 teens who committed the mass shooting. and it was taken off of a video cam. Moving on, the second point is that violent video games are threatening because their main demographic, which is adolescents and kids, are very vulnerable to the dangers of games. The first reason they are vulnerable is because their brains are still developing. Drew Edwards explained that kids and teens are very differently affected by the violent video games than adults are. Jay Geed, who works with the National Institute of Mental Health, showed us that the brain continues to develop through the teens and through the 20s, early 20s. Elizabeth Sowell did a study which compared teen brains with the brains of those in their 20s. And she came up with results that showed us that the frontal lobes, which are in charge of your decision making and your judgment and your self-control and your emotions, she showed us that they're still developing between puberty and between young adulthood. That's a very crucial age for brain development, and exposure to such violent video games can affect the way your brain is developed. And Gid goes into more detail about that, and he tells us that teens have the ability to determine their own brain development. Basically, whether they're being involved in music, in art, or in video games, they're figuring out what they need to survive, and they are adapting to these things. So basically, game content can shape the way your brain develops. The parietal lobes are still developing, and they're responsible for processing visual and auditory information. The games have violent sound effects as well as violent images, and that can really affect the way your brain develops and the way you learn to deal with certain situations. The temporal lobe is also, its gray matter doesn't reach its full maximum until 16 years of age. The temporal lobe is in charge of emotional maturity. So you can see why that would be a problem too. If you're a kid and you're 16, your emotions have not fully developed yet and you don't have full control over them. So something like violent video games can have more of an emotional toll on you and affect you. You're going to act and react differently to different things rather than if you're an adult playing these games. Secondly, teens and kids are most vulnerable to violent video games because adults often neglect their responsibility to protect the kids. Statistics show that only 15% of 8th and 9th graders claim that their parents always or usually check the video game rating before allowing them to make a decision. 53% say that parents never check. 33% of Americans with kids who play video games admit that their kids play whatever games they want to play. And lastly is the lack of regulation. There are no laws right now in the U.S. that prohibit the sale of violent video games to minors. Dr. Elizabeth Carl, who's a chair of Interactive Media Committee, suggested that we have a more specific rating system, and that would help the parents better understand what exactly is in the video games. Should they or should they not allow them to play the video games? She also said that games should be tested by a non-biased organization so that before they're released to the public. We can conclude that because of negative behavioral effects, the vulnerability of kids and teens, and the lack of regulation on the content of the games, violent video games are potentially harmful and dangerous. You can also see from these pictures that our kids are learning violence at a very young age, and I think that video games are teaching them how to use guns, and I think we should reconsider the effects that these games really do have on our children and the way that they interact with others.